In the midst of the worst blizzard Lancaster had seen in decades, Levi Stoltzfus looked out at his snow-covered fields, knowing that without firewood, his family would not survive the cold. The tunnel he'd built in secret, a labor of quiet love and ingenuity, was his only hope. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of faith, perseverance, and the strength of simple solutions touch your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. Levi Stoltzfus had lived through many winters, each one more challenging than the last, but nothing prepared him for the storm that began on the morning of December 15th, 1952. The snow started falling lightly at first, dusting the fields with a soft layer of white. But as the morning wore on, the wind picked up and the snow turned into a violent, unrelenting blizzard. By noon the trees were bent low under the weight of the snow, and the landscape was swallowed by an endless curtain of white. Inside his simple farmhouse, Levi sat by the hearth, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of herbal tea. Naomi, his wife of 15 years, moved quietly in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal. The fire crackled, casting a warm, golden glow on their small home. To the outside world it seemed like any other cold winter's day, but Levi knew better. He had been watching the skies for days, sensing that this storm would be unlike any other. The signs were there, the deep cold settling in early, the unusual quiet before the snow began. Naomi had noticed it too. The way Levi spent more time outside, checking the weather and moving supplies around, but she had no idea what was in his mind. She had no way of knowing that Levi had prepared for this moment in a way no one else could have imagined. As the storm continued to rage, Levi's thoughts turned to the firewood. He had stocked up early, cutting and splitting enough to last through the winter. But now, as the storm gathered force, the wood pile outside, stacked neatly beside the barn, was buried beneath several feet of snow. If the blizzard continued, they would run out of firewood by morning, and without it, they would freeze. Levi knew that he had to act quickly. The fire that had warmed their home so far could not be allowed to die out. He had built something in secret, something no one knew about except Naomi, and even she had only the faintest understanding of its purpose. In the darkness of the barn, beneath the floorboards, was a tunnel. It was narrow and cold, but it would carry them through the worst of the storm. Levi Stoltzfus had always believed in the power of preparation, the kind of preparation that didn't just rely on luck or the convenience of what could be seen. It was the kind of preparation that required vision, a vision for survival, for family, for the land. And so, during the summer months when others were busy with their harvests, Levi had worked alone in the barn, digging in secret. The tunnel, which stretched from beneath the barn to the woodlot near the far edge of his property, had been a labor of love and necessity. No one knew about it, not even his neighbors. Naomi had noticed him working long hours, hauling dirt and materials into the barn, but she had never asked too many questions. To her, it was just another of Levi's eccentric projects, like the time he'd built a sturdy, handcrafted wagon from scratch, or the time he'd carved intricate designs into the family's wooden furniture. But this project, this tunnel, was different. Levi had started it quietly, using only the simplest of tools. The earth was soft in places, but he had to dig carefully, making sure the tunnel wouldn't collapse. For months he worked by lantern light, digging and reinforcing the walls with thick wooden beams. The tunnel stretched about 50 feet, snaking its way through the earth, until it emerged in a small clearing on the edge of the woodlot, where the best firewood grew untouched by the storm. The idea had come to him one autumn evening as the wind howled outside and the leaves turned crisp and brown. He had realized that the blizzards of Lancaster were unlike anything else, unpredictable and unyielding. He could not rely solely on the wood stacked outside the barn. The elements were too harsh, too powerful. And so, in the dead of night, he had begun his work, his way of ensuring that no matter what the storm brought, his family would survive. Naomi had questioned the extra work, the strange hours he kept, but Levi never explained. He simply said that there would come a day when they would need it, And that day had come. As the storm raged on, Levi smiled faintly to himself. He had done the work when no one was looking, trusting in the quiet certainty of his faith. Now it was time to put his labor to the test. Without a word to Naomi, Levi grabbed a lantern and made his way to the barn. There he knelt beside the hidden trapdoor he had installed in the floor and pried it open, revealing the dark, narrow tunnel below. With each step he took down the cold, earthen passageway, he knew that he was not just hauling firewood, and he was hauling his family's safety, one log at a time. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, the storm had reached its full fury. Snow now fell in thick, swirling sheets, carried on a wind so cold it bit through wool and skin alike. The trees outside the Stoltzfus home were bent low, their limbs heavy with snow. The roads, once visible, were now completely lost under a blanket of white. Inside the house, Naomi looked out the window, her breath fogging the glass. She saw nothing but white, felt nothing but the bone-chilling wind seeping through the cracks in their door. She turned to the fire, which crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth pushing back against the chill. But even with the fire, she could sense the house growing colder, and she could hear the wind outside howling louder, more menacing now. Levi, however, was focused. He had known this storm was coming, and he had prepared for it in every way he knew how. The food stores were stocked, the candles were set to burn through the nights, and the firewood, well, that was the only thing left to be dealt with. He had seen the storm's ferocity before, and it was clear to him that the pile outside would be gone by morning. He stood up from his place at the table, glancing once at Naomi, who still stood by the window, her eyes worried but resigned. He didn't speak, but Naomi knew. They had both known what was at stake for days. It was the moment they had quietly feared, when the preparations for winter would either pay off or leave them at the mercy of the storm. Without a word, Levi moved toward the barn. Naomi, sensing the weight of the moment, followed him, her footsteps soft on the snow-covered floorboards. As they stepped into the cold barn, Levi motioned her to stay near the entrance. He bent down and opened the trapdoor beneath him. The tunnel below looked the same as it always had. Narrow, dark, and just wide enough for him to carry a bundle of firewood at a time. Naomi watched, her breath catching as she realized what he was about to do. It was a strange thing, this tunnel. Strange and brilliant, but it had been built in quiet secrecy, in moments of doubt, when neither of them had truly known how bad the coming storm would be. Levi took the lantern from the shelf and stepped into the passageway. The cold earth beneath him was firm and steady. He had made sure of it. There was no turning back now. As the storm outside raged on, Levi began his work, silently moving log after log, hauling firewood from the woodlot, his muscles straining with the weight, his breath fogging in the icy air. Naomi, standing by the barn's entrance, watched the light of the lantern fade in and out of sight as Levi moved through the tunnel, preparing their survival, piece by piece. The night outside seemed endless as the storm howled like a wild animal, its force rattling the windows of the farmhouse. Inside, the warmth of the hearth clung to the walls, but it felt like a fragile thing, as if the cold outside could swallow it up at any moment. Naomi sat by the fire, knitting a shawl by the soft glow of the candlelight, her hands moving automatically, but her mind was far from the quiet task. She knew that her husband was working in the dark, down in the tunnel, carrying firewood with the quiet diligence of a man who had learned long ago that survival depended on both faith and preparation. But Naomi also knew that this storm was testing them in ways they had not yet experienced. The snow had already piled high, and the wind had shifted its angle. It was no longer just a cold winter storm. It was a force of nature, one that could break even the most steadfast of men. She thought of Levi and his quiet strength, and in that moment she was filled with both pride and fear. He had always been a man of deep faith, a man who believed that every task, no matter how small, had a purpose. He had been preparing for this storm for months, but as the night stretched on, Naomi wondered, had he prepared enough? Levi, meanwhile, felt a quiet confidence as he worked his way through the tunnel. His hands ached, his back screamed in protest with each movement, but he never hesitated. This was the purpose he had built the tunnel for. This was the plan, a plan that was now being tested in the cold, dark silence of the earth. As the log slid from his hands and into the farmhouse piece by piece, Levi thought of his father, of the lessons he had learned in the fields and in the barn. He had been taught to prepare for the worst, to trust in the land, and to always have faith. But there was one thing his father had never told him. That preparation, no matter how thorough, could sometimes be tested in ways that couldn't be foreseen. The warmth of the house beckoned him, just as it beckoned Naomi, whose gaze still lingered at the barn's entrance. She had seen the lantern light flicker through the tunnel, but she knew Levi would not stop until he had enough wood to see them through. Her mind was filled with thoughts of the warmth of their home, the safety of their family, and the understanding that sometimes faith wasn't just about prayer, it was about action. With each log Levi brought through the tunnel, he felt a quiet peace wash over him. The storm outside was fierce, but inside there was a sense of calm, as if their quiet labor, born from faith and patience, was enough to withstand whatever the storm threw at them. The storm raged on throughout the night, and the steady howl of the wind became a constant companion in the farmhouse. Naomi lay awake in bed, her mind restless as she listened to the wind beat against the windows. Levi, despite his exhaustion, had continued his work in the tunnel, hauling firewood into the house with quiet resolve. Each trip seemed to stretch the hours of the night, but Naomi knew her husband well. He would not rest until the task was done. At last, as the first light of dawn began to push through the heavy clouds, the storm began to subside. The wind weakened, and the snow, though still thick on the ground, no longer fell in blinding sheets. It was a welcome sight, but Naomi's relief was tempered by the heavy silence that followed the storm. The fire in the hearth had burned low through the night, and the warmth of the house, though still present, felt fragile. Levi had returned to the house, his face pale from the cold and his movements slower than usual. But there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes, and Naomi could see it in the way he looked at the fire, the way he allowed the warmth to seep into his bones. "I've brought in enough to last us for a while," he said quietly, sitting by the hearth and rubbing his hands together. "But the storm's not over yet, Naomi. We must be prepared." Naomi nodded, but there was no need for words. She had seen the effort he had put in, and though the storm had subsided, she knew their work was far from over. The house, their home, was safe for now, but they still had to face the coming days and the challenges that lay ahead. "Thank you," she said softly, placing her hand on his. "Thank you for doing this. I was afraid for you." Levi smiled, though it was a weary smile. "We are not alone, Naomi, not as long as we have each other." The snow had begun to fall lightly once again as they sat together, their breath fogging in the cool morning air. But now there was a sense of renewal, of hope. The worst had passed, and the strength they had found together had kept them safe. Naomi looked out the window at the white fields, now dotted with footprints from the tunnel. They would still have to wait for the full thaw, but the warmth in their home felt like a promise. They had weathered the storm, and with it they had reaffirmed what they already knew, that faith, hard work, and love were enough to carry them through. Days passed, and while the storm had ended, the aftermath lingered. The snow, once fresh and pure, had turned to heavy, icy drifts that blocked roads and pathways, making it nearly impossible for anyone to travel. The world outside was still buried beneath layers of snow and ice, and it would be weeks before the roads were cleared. The Stoltzfus family, however, had managed to weather the storm, not only because of their preparation, but also because of the quiet ingenuity that Levi had hidden away. In the days following the blizzard, neighbors began to check in. They came in groups, their buggies struggling through the deep snow, to offer help or simply to see how the Stoltzfus family had fared. As they entered the house, they were greeted by the warmth of the fire, the scent of fresh bread from Naomi's oven, and the quiet satisfaction that came from surviving such a fierce storm. When Levi's neighbors, Samuel and Eli, entered the barn, their eyes widened at the sight of the tunnel entrance. At first they couldn't understand what they were looking at. The tunnel, while simple in its design, had remained hidden for so long that no one had even suspected its existence. It was a marvel, a testament to Levi's quiet determination. "I didn't even know you had been working on this," Samuel said, his voice filled with awe. Levi nodded, his face flushed from the cold, but there was no pride in his expression, only a quiet peace. "It was a necessity," he explained simply. "The storm came sooner than we thought, and I knew that without firewood we would be in trouble. The tunnel allowed me to bring in the wood while the storm raged outside. We would have run out of firewood by now, if not for it." Eli, ever the skeptic, glanced at the ground, his brow furrowed. "But we're not the only ones affected by these storms. Why keep it secret?" Levi looked out over the snowy fields, his eyes distant. "Not everything needs to be known by everyone. This tunnel was built out of love for my family, not for praise. I knew we might need it one day, and I built it in secret, so it would be there when we did." As the neighbors left, they exchanged looks, nodding in understanding. They had their own preparations, their own means of surviving the harsh winters, but none of them had ever thought to create something as practical as Levi's tunnel. As the weeks wore on and the snow began to slowly melt, the Stoltzfus family returned to their routine. The firewood, once carefully hidden away in the earth beneath their feet, was now stacked neatly by the hearth. The tunnel, though still a hidden part of the barn, had become a legacy of sorts. Levi had not only ensured their survival, but had also left behind something that no one could have predicted, a reminder of what it meant to prepare with quiet faith and humility. Though Levi never spoke of it again, the tunnel had become a symbol in the community. It was a quiet, steadfast answer to the question of how one man could stand strong against the storm. And the answer was simple: through faith, through family, and through the strength of love, even when it was hidden deep beneath the earth. As winter continued to tighten its grip on Lancaster, the Stoltzfus family found themselves settling into a rhythm. The storm that had battered their home had left its mark, but the days that followed were quiet, filled with routine and simple comforts. Levi, though still weary from the long nights spent hauling firewood through the hidden tunnel, found a deep sense of peace in the stillness of the winter landscape. Naomi continued her work around the house, mending clothes, tending to the garden in the cellar, and caring for their 2 young children. Despite the cold, the warmth inside their home was constant, and it had become a place not only of shelter, but of reflection. Levi often found himself drawn to the window, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy layers. But his mind wasn't on the weather. He was thinking of the tunnel. No one else knew about the tunnel except for Naomi, and even then only a vague understanding of its purpose. But Levi had spent years working in secret, creating something that might never be needed. But if it was, it would be the only thing standing between his family and the dangers of a harsh Lancaster winter. Now, with the storm gone, it seemed almost surreal that such a labor of love and preparation had proven to be so vital. Each time he crossed the threshold of their warm home, Levi was reminded of the power of simple solutions. The firewood, brought in piece by piece from beneath the earth, had been their salvation. It wasn't the grandest of gestures, but it was enough. And sometimes, in a world that was always shifting, always uncertain, enough was all they could hope for. One evening, as Levi sat by the hearth with Naomi, the crackle of the fire filling the silence, he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "We've been blessed, Naomi. I've seen the way the world can change in a single moment, but if we have each other, and if we trust in what we can do with our hands and hearts, We will always find a way through." Naomi nodded, her hands folded in her lap as she looked at him. She had always trusted Levi's strength, not just in the physical sense, but in his ability to think ahead, to plan, and to protect the family they had built together. His humility, his quiet resolve, had always been what had drawn her to him. And now, as they sat together in the warmth of their home, she understood once again the power of those simple acts, of preparing not for today but for tomorrow. The storm had taught them both something profound. It wasn't the most dramatic solutions that made a difference, but the small, quiet ones that came from a deep place of love. The kind of preparation that no one else could see, but that made all the difference when the world outside was nothing but a violent, unrelenting force. Spring was on the horizon, though the snow still lingered in the shaded corners of the fields, and the air carried a sharp chill. The Stoltzfus family had survived the worst of the winter, and though the weight of the storm had passed, a new season of challenges began. The land, still blanketed by snow, was slow to thaw, and the fields would need time to prepare before the planting season began. But the quiet months of winter, with their heavy snowfall and the hidden tunnel that had saved them, had provided an unexpected test of faith, one that, in its own way, was still unfolding. The story of the tunnel had remained within the family, a secret of sorts that only Naomi truly understood. But as the weeks went on, whispers began to spread through the community. Levi had heard the quiet murmurs of admiration, even from those who had once doubted his decisions. The neighbors, who had once called him too cautious or too slow, were now speaking of his foresight in quieter tones, with respect. Levi had always kept his faith close to his chest, never seeking attention or praise for his actions. It was enough for him to know that his family was safe, that the decisions he had made were the right ones. But as the thaw of spring began to melt away the winter's remnants, he couldn't help but reflect on the deeper lesson, the lesson that had come not just from surviving a storm, but from trusting in quiet faith and patience. The tunnel, while a physical manifestation of his preparedness, had become something else, a symbol of perseverance, a testament to the strength that can be found in simple acts. For weeks, Levi had wondered if the effort he put into something that might never be needed was worth it. But now, looking back at the way his family had weathered the worst storm in years, he understood that it was never about the storm itself. It was about the quiet, unshakable trust in what could be done, in what could be built, when the world outside seemed uncertain. One evening, as Levi worked the fields with his plow, Naomi watched from the doorway, her arms folded across her chest. The ground was still cold and unforgiving, but Levi's steady rhythm never wavered. She knew that the land was teaching him something new, just as the storm had. The challenges of survival were always there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was the strength of faith and the humility of simple labor that allowed them to meet those challenges head-on. Levi paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and looked toward the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden light over the land. For a moment, he felt that quiet peace again, the same peace he had felt during the storm. It was the peace of knowing that, no matter what came next, he had done everything he could to ensure his family's survival. As the days grew longer and the snow began to melt, Lancaster slowly awoke from its winter slumber. The land, once suffocated under layers of ice and snow, now showed the first signs of life. The first crocus buds peeked through the thawing earth, and the air, though still cool, carried the promise of spring. But for Levi Stoltzfus, spring brought with it something different, a quiet reflection on the events that had unfolded over the past several months. Levi had never sought recognition for his actions. The tunnel, the hidden labor beneath the barn, was never meant to be seen by others. It had been built out of necessity, not pride, and for that reason it remained a secret for so long. However, As the spring thawed the earth and the world began to move again, the story of the tunnel began to spread, whispered among the community like a quiet hymn. Neighbors who had once mocked his slow, careful way of doing things now sought his advice. They came to him, not with questions about firewood or survival, but with questions about how to live with faith in an unpredictable world. How could they, too, prepare for the worst while maintaining their belief that the simple, everyday acts of life were enough? It was a humbling experience for Levi. He had never intended to be a leader or a symbol of faith. He was just a farmer, a husband, a father. But the storm had forced him into a position he had never sought. As the winter's harshness melted away, so too did any lingering doubts about the value of his actions. Naomi, ever observant and quiet, noticed the change in Levi as well. He had always been a man of quiet strength, but now there was a deeper stillness in him, a peace that came from knowing that the things he had built, both in the earth and in his life, had stood the test of time. There was no boast in his demeanor, no claim to be anything more than he had ever been. But Naomi saw the grace in his humility, in his willingness to continue with the work at hand without seeking anything in return. One afternoon, as Levi sat on the front porch watching the sun dip low in the sky, Samuel, one of the neighbors, approached. He had a slight smile on his face, and as he sat down next to Levi, he said quietly, "You know, Levi, there are many who have learned from what you did." Levi nodded but didn't speak. He knew what Samuel meant. The tunnel, the firewood, the faith that had carried them through the worst storm. It was a lesson not just for him, but for everyone who had been touched by it. What you did, Samuel continued, wasn't just about surviving a storm. It was about showing all of us that sometimes the simplest solutions are the strongest. You built something that no one saw, but everyone felt. Levi smiled, his tired eyes reflecting the fading light of the day. Sometimes the best things are the ones that are hidden. You don't do them for praise, but because they're what's needed. Samuel sat in silence for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Levi, for showing us that faith, hard work, and love are the true answers to life's storms. The warmth of spring gradually settled over Lancaster, and as the flowers bloomed and the earth came alive again, Levi Stoltzfus found himself standing at the edge of his fields, his gaze resting on the patch of earth where the tunnel had begun. The barn had long since returned to its place in the routine of their lives, and the earth, once frozen, was now soft and pliable. But as Levi looked toward the woodlot, memories of the storm, of the tunnel, and of the long winter's nights rushed back. He had often wondered if the tunnel, with its secret purpose and quiet labor, would ever be needed again. The storm of '52 had been an anomaly, a rare and violent occurrence in a life that was otherwise defined by simplicity. But Levi understood that storms, both literal and metaphorical, were inevitable. They came without warning, often in the quietest moments, shaking the foundations of everything one thought was certain. Now, standing there with the sun warming his face, he realized that it wasn't the tunnel itself that mattered. It was the lesson it taught him, the realization that there was no challenge too great, no winter too harsh, when one had the strength of faith and family to rely on. That was the true gift the storm had given him. As the community began its spring planting, neighbors who had watched Levi's work from afar now sought his help in their own ways. They asked him how he built the tunnel, how he knew to prepare for such an uncertain storm. Levi's answer was always the same. It's about trusting in what you know, even when others doubt it. It's about knowing that the work you do today may be the very thing that carries you through tomorrow. Levi knew that his simple actions had shown more than just survival. They had shown resilience. They had shown that faith wasn't something that could be seen or touched, but something that was carried in the quiet, humble decisions made every day. One evening, as the last of the evening sun kissed the horizon, Levi walked to the barn with Naomi by his side. They passed the woodlot, now cleared of snow, and stopped for a moment to look at the horizon. The world once again was in motion. The storm had passed and life had returned to its rhythm. They had weathered it, not just as survivors, but as a family united in purpose and love. Levi turned to Naomi, his voice soft and sure. "We're stronger than we know, Naomi. The storm may pass, but what we build together, that stays." She smiled, her heart full. "I know, Levi, I know." And with that, the Stoltzfus family returned to their life, their faith, and the quiet, powerful truth that simple things, like love, hard work, and preparation, would always see them through.